The ink on the foreclosure deed was still wet when Viscount Alistair ordered his guards to throw me into the snow. He laughed, swirling his expensive wine, mocking my poverty one last time. He didn't realize that while he slept, I had purchased every single one of his debts. I didn't just own the roof over his head, I owned the very chair he sat in. He called me a beggar. I looked him in the eye and whispered, "Get out of my house." Before we watch his empire crumble, hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments, which city are you watching this story from? I want to know where my allies are gathering. The ending I just described felt inevitable, written in the stars like a constellation of retribution, but the beginning was far quieter. It began not with a shout, but with the scratching of a quill against parchment in a room that smelled of old leather and stale cigar smoke. It was 3 hours before the snowstorm would fully descend upon Stirling Manor. The library was cold. It was always cold. Alistair refused to pay for coal to heat the servants' wing or the workspaces, reserving the warmth only for the grand salon where he entertained guests who secretly despised him. I sat at the heavy oak desk that had belonged to his father, my fingers stained with black ink, tallying a column of numbers that refused to balance. I had been the ward of this estate since I was 10 years old, taken in by the late Earl out of charity, or perhaps guilt. I was raised alongside Alistair. We had run through these halls together, scraped our knees on the same garden statues, and shared secrets in the hayloft. I had foolishly thought those years built a bond that transcended rank. I thought my devotion to keeping his estate afloat, my sleepless nights balancing his reckless ledgers, meant I was his partner. I was wrong. I was simply his convenience. The heavy mahogany doors swung open, banging against the wall. Viscount Alistair Stirling strode in, bringing with him the scent of brandy and the chill of the hallway. He was handsome, in that careless aristocratic way that suggests the world exists solely to be stepped upon by his polished boots. His cravat was loose, his eyes bright with a manic energy I had come to dread. "Evelyn!" he shouted, his voice echoing off the high, dust-moated shelves. "Why is the library so dreary? We are celebrating tonight." I didn't look up from the ledger. I couldn't. If I looked at him, I might scream. "There is nothing to celebrate, my lord," I said, my voice steady, practicing the patience I had perfected over a decade. "I have just received the quarterly notices from the bank in London. You are overdrawn, again. The grain shipment was sold at a loss because you refused to authorise the repairs to the storage barn and the roof leaked." Alistair waved a dismissive hand, walking over to the globe in the corner and spinning it aggressively. "Details, Evelyn, always the tedious little details with you. You act as if a few rotting sacks of wheat define the legacy of the Stirlings." "It is not just wheat, Alistair," I said, finally laying the quill down. The silence that followed was heavy. "It is the staff's wages. It is the interest on the loans you took to buy that racing horse, the one that went lame last week. We are drowning. If we do not make a payment by the end of the month, the solicitors will not be sending letters. They will be sending the sheriff." He laughed. It was a hollow, ugly sound. He walked around the desk, leaning down so his face was inches from mine. I could smell the alcohol on his breath, sweet and cloying. "We? There is no we, Evelyn. There is the Stirling family, and then there is the help." The word struck me harder than a physical blow. The help. After 12 years of managing his accounts, covering his mistakes, lying to his creditors, and nursing him through fevers, I was the help. "I see," I whispered, closing the ledger. "Then perhaps the help should inform you that there is no money for the grand ball you wish to host next week." "Oh, but there is," he grinned, a predatory gleam in his eyes. He straightened up, adjusting his cuffs. "I have solved our little financial inconvenience. I am to be married." The air left my lungs. For a moment, foolishly, my heart leaped. We had never spoken of it explicitly, but there had been moments, glances, touches, that made me think, married? I asked. To Lady Clara distinct. Her father is the railroad tycoon. New money, of course, utterly vulgar people, but her dowry is astronomical. It will clear the debts and leave enough for me to finally renovate the stables. Lady Clara, a woman who had visited once and complained that the library smelled of musty books. She didn't know the estate. She didn't love the land. She was a checkbook in a silk dress. Alistair, I stood up, my hands trembling. You cannot marry for debt relief. The estate requires management, not just a cash injection. If you continue to spend like this, even her dowry will be gone in 2 years. His face darkened. The playful facade vanished, replaced by the sneering arrogance of a man who hates being told the truth. You are jealous, he spat. That's what this is. You thought, what? That I would marry you? The orphan with ink on her fingers? I thought you valued loyalty, I said, my voice breaking. Loyalty doesn't buy horses, Evelyn, and it certainly doesn't secure a dynasty. You have no name. You have no connections. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a cruel whisper. You have no dowry? He laughed then, as if it were the funniest joke in the world. I need a wife, Evelyn, not a glorified accountant. In fact, Lady Clara has already expressed her discomfort with your presence here. She feels it is improper for a single woman of your age to be living under my roof. I froze. My age? I am 22. Ancient, he dismissed. Pack your things. You leave tonight. Tonight? I looked toward the window. The snow was beginning to stick to the glass. Alistair, a storm is coming. The roads will be impassable. Then you better start walking now. He turned his back on me, pouring himself a drink from the crystal decanter on the side table. I've instructed the steward to give you £5. Consider it a severance for your distinct services. £5. For a lifetime. I looked at his back. I looked at the library I had curated, the books I had saved from damp, the ledgers I had balanced to keep him safe. A cold resolve settled over me, colder than the wind outside. Very well, I said. He didn't turn around. He didn't see me open the hidden drawer in the desk, the one only I knew about. He didn't see me take the small leather-bound journal. It didn't look like much. It wasn't the official ledger. It was my ledger. The one where I recorded the account numbers he was too lazy to memorize, the combination to the family safe in London, and the details of the illegal offshore accounts his father had set up years ago. I tucked the book into the bodice of my dress. Goodbye, Alistair, I said. Close the door on your way out, he mumbled, already drinking. I walked to the hallway. The servants were nowhere to be seen. He must have ordered them away to avoid witnesses to my humiliation. I grabbed my coat from the hook. I didn't take clothes. I didn't take the £5. I walked to the heavy oak doors of Stirling Manor. As I stepped out into the biting wind, the snow whipped against my face, stinging my skin. The heavy door slammed shut behind me, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the silent valley. I stood there for a moment, shivering, looking back at the glowing window of the library. I could see his silhouette, raising a glass to his reflection. He thought he had thrown out a burden. He had no idea he had just handed the weapon of his destruction to his greatest enemy. I touched the journal against my chest. I turned away from the house and began to walk into the dark, freezing night. I had no money, no coat warm enough for this weather, and no destination. But as the cold seeped into my bones, a single burning thought kept me warm. He forgot one thing. He forgot that I was the one who taught him how to count. I smiled into the darkness. Would I survive the night? And if I did, how could a penniless orphan possibly topple a viscount? I didn't know yet. But as I saw a carriage approaching in the distance, slowing down as if the driver saw a ghost in the snow, I realized the game had just begun. London did not smell of roses and damp earth like the country lanes of Stirling Manor. It smelled of wet coal, horse manure, and the desperate sweat of a million souls climbing over one another to survive. 6 months had passed since the heavy oak doors of my childhood home were slammed in my face, and in that time I had learned that dignity was a luxury the poor could not afford. My kingdom was no longer a vast library with floor-to-ceiling windows. It was a room the size of a pantry on the 3rd floor of Mrs. Gable's boarding house in East London. The wallpaper was peeling in strips like dead skin, revealing the damp plaster beneath, and the single window rattled violently whenever a heavy carriage passed on the cobblestones below. I owned one dress, a severe grey wool garment I had purchased from a second-hand shop, and a pair of boots that leaked whenever it rained, which in London was every day. But I was not dead, and I was not defeated. I sat on the edge of my narrow cot, counting the copper coins in my palm. 4 shillings and 6pence. That was the sum of my existence. It was enough for rent, a loaf of stale bread, and perhaps a candle to read by. If I skipped dinner, I could afford a stamp to send a letter I would never write. I carefully placed the coins into a hollowed-out space beneath the floorboard under my bed. It was there, wrapped in an oilcloth to protect it from the damp, that I kept the journal I had stolen from Alistair's desk. It was the only thing of value I possessed, yet I could not eat it, and I could not wear it. It was a seed that needed time to grow. By day, I was invisible. I had secured a position at Thorne & Higgins, a mid-level investment firm in the financial district. I was not hired for my mind, of course. I was hired because my handwriting was impeccable, and I asked for wages that a man would have scoffed at. They called me a clerk, but in truth, I was a ghost. I spent 12 hours a day standing at a high desk in a room filled with cigar smoke and the scratching of quills. The men around me, junior partners with soft hands and loud voices, discussed the market with the confidence of toddlers playing with fire. They boasted about railway shares and shipping lanes, puffing out their chests while making elementary errors in their calculations. I saw every mistake. When Mr. Higgins, the senior partner, left his ledger open to go to lunch, I would glide over, my eyes scanning the columns. A misplaced decimal here, a forgotten carryover there. In my head, I corrected them. In my head, I ran the firm better than they ever could. But I said nothing. I was the grey woman in the corner. To speak was to be seen, and to be seen was to be fired. That afternoon, the office was buzzing with more energy than usual. A newspaper had been discarded on a side table stained with coffee rings. I picked it up while pretending to file a stack of invoices. The headline screamed in bold black ink, "Viscount Sterling to host the ball of the century, a lavish welcome for his bride-to-be." My hand tightened on the paper, crumpling the edge. There was a sketch of Alistair, looking dashing and carefree. The article described the preparations: imported French silk for the draperies, 1,000 white orchids to be delivered from hothouses in the south, and a diamond necklace commissioned for Lady Clara that was rumoured to cost more than the annual GDP of a small colony. I felt a physical pain in my chest, a hot, sharp pang that tasted like bile. He was spending money he didn't have. He was burning the estate's future to warm his vanity. I knew the accounts. I knew that every orchid, every yard of silk was bought on credit extended only because the lenders believed in the lie of the sterling legacy. Reading the society pages, Miss Thorne, I jumped. It was Mr. Higgins. He was a portly man with a moustache that twitched when he was suspicious. I was merely clearing the table, sir, I lied, folding the paper quickly. See that you do, he grunted, taking a bite of a pastry that dropped flakes onto his waistcoat. Leave the dreaming to the ladies of leisure. We have work to do. The Consolidated Bank is demanding an audit of the railway bonds. Fetch the files from the archive room, the dusty ones at the back. Yes, sir. I retreated to the archive room, my heart hammering against my ribs. The archive was my sanctuary. It was a windowless closet, stacked high with boxes of abandoned dreams, failed ventures, foreclosed properties, and bad debts. I climbed the ladder to reach the top shelf, the dust coating my throat. I pulled down the box marked Distressed Assets, 1890. As I sifted through the bundles of papers, looking for the railway bonds, a familiar name caught my eye on a misfiled folder. The Sterling Trust. I froze. The folder was thin, tied with a fraying red ribbon. My hands trembled as I pulled it out. Why would my employer have a file on Alistair's family? Thorne and Higgins dealt with secondary markets, buying bad debt from larger banks to collect on it aggressively. I opened the folder. Inside was not a loan agreement, but a piece of correspondence from Alistair's father, the late Earl, dated 10 years ago. It was a frantic letter addressed to a notorious lender in the city, a man known for breaking thumbs rather than filing lawsuits. The Earl had borrowed a massive sum against the mineral rights of the estate, rights that I knew for a fact did not exist. The land was farmland, not a mine. But the document beneath the letter was what made the room spin. It was a transfer of that debt. The loan had been sold, resold, and bundled into a package of high-risk liabilities that Thorne and Higgins had acquired just last week for pennies on the dollar. My firm owned a piece of Alistair, and they didn't even know it. To them, it was just another line item in a ledger of junk bonds, likely to be written off as a loss. I looked at the value. The face value of the debt was £10,000, but because it was considered uncollectible due to the age of the note, the firm had valued it at £200. £200. The price of a viscount's ruin was less than the cost of the diamond necklace he was buying for Lady Clara. I stood there on the ladder, the dust swirling in the shaft of light from the hallway. I thought of my 4 shillings and 6pence under the floorboard. I was miles away from £200. I might as well have tried to jump to the moon. But then I remembered the error. Earlier that day, I had seen Mr. Higgins approve a payout for a shipping insurance claim that was clearly fraudulent. He had signed the cheque in a rush, eager to get to his club. The carbon copy was still on his desk. If that cheque was processed, the firm would lose £500. If someone intervened, if someone caught the mistake before it went to the bank, the partners would be grateful. They often paid a finder's fee for internal audits that saved the company significant capital, usually 10%, £50. It wasn't 200, but it was a start. And I knew something about numbers that Alistair did not. They compounded. I shoved the sterling file to the very back of the shelf, behind a stack of water-damaged shipping manifests where no one would ever look. I climbed down the ladder, smoothing my grey dress. I walked back into the main office. The air was thick with the smell of ink and greed. Mr. Higgins was putting on his coat to leave for the day. "Sir," I said, my voice cutting through the hum of the room. It was louder than I had ever spoken before. He turned, annoyed. "What is it, girl? I'm late." "The shipping claim for the HMS Victoria," I said, holding up the carbon copy I had swiped from his desk. "You approved the payout." "So? It's standard procedure." "The HMS Victoria is a river barge, sir," I said clearly so the junior partners could hear. "The claim is for deep-sea storm damage. A river barge cannot suffer deep-sea storm damage unless it was dragged into the Atlantic by a kraken. It is a fraud. You almost signed away £500. The room went silent. The scratching of quills stopped. Mr. Higgins turned a shade of purple that clashed horribly with his cravat. He snatched the paper from my hand, scanning it. His eyes widened. He stammered, "I was merely testing you. Yes, testing the staff's diligence." "Of course, sir." I lowered my head, hiding the smirk that threatened to break through. "I assumed as much." He cleared his throat, looking around at his partners who were now staring at him. He needed to save face. He needed to look like a benevolent mentor rather than a fool. "Good catch, Miss Thorne," he muttered, digging into his pocket. He pulled out a coin purse. "A bonus for your diligence." He tossed 3 gold sovereigns onto my desk. £3. It was an insult. It was a fraction of what I deserved. But as I looked at the gold glinting against the dark wood, I didn't see £3. I saw the first brick in the wall I was going to build around Alistair sterling. I took the coins. "Thank you, sir." I walked home that night through the freezing rain, my boots squelching with every step. I was cold, I was hungry, and I was exhausted. But as I passed a newsstand and saw Alistair's face on the paper again, smiling his arrogant smile, I didn't feel the chill. I had found the paper trail, I knew where the bodies were buried, and now I had £3 to buy a shovel. I reached my boarding house and climbed the stairs. I needed to calculate how to turn £3 into 200. It was impossible math. It was a gambler's fantasy. But as I opened my door, I saw something that stopped my heart. My room had been tossed. The mattress was overturned. The floorboard was pried up. My breathing stopped. I rushed to the hole in the floor. The oilcloth was gone. The coins were gone. But worst of all, the journal. The book containing the codes to the sterling accounts. It was gone. I stood up, spinning around, panic rising in my throat like bile. And then I saw it. A single piece of paper pinned to the wall with a knife. It wasn't a note from a thief. It was a note on distinct, heavy cream stationery. The kind with a watermark I knew better than my own face. "Did you really think you could hide from us, Evelyn? I wasn't just poor anymore, I was hunted. I did not sleep that night. I sat in the corner of my ravaged room, clutching a kitchen knife I had stolen from the boarding house pantry, watching the door. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind that rattled the window pane sounded like an assassin's footstep. The note pinned to my wall. "Did you really think you could hide from us, Evelyn?" burned into my retinas. It was written on sterling stationery, the cream-coloured paper heavy and rich, smelling faintly of the lavender polish used on the mahogany desks in the Viscount's study. But the handwriting, it was jagged, crude. It wasn't Alistair's elegant, lazy scrawl. It was the hand of someone who held a pen like a dagger. By dawn, the adrenaline had soured into a cold, hard knot in my stomach. They had taken my journal. They had taken the codes to the offshore accounts. They had taken the few coins I had saved. They thought they had stripped me bare. But as the grey morning light filtered through the grime of the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the cold air, I realised something. If they had found what they were looking for, the proof of Alistair's fraud, they would have killed me. The fact that I was still breathing meant the journal wasn't enough. They couldn't read my shorthand. They couldn't decipher the ciphers I had invented when I was 12 years old to keep my diary safe from prying eyes. They had the map, but they didn't have the key. I was the key. I washed my face in the basin of freezing water, the shock of the cold tightening my skin. I pinned up my hair, put on my severe grey dress, and walked out of the boarding house. I was not going to run. Running was an admission of guilt. I was going to work. The offices of Thorne and Higgins were a sanctuary of noise and indifference. No one looked at me. To them, I was just part of the furniture, as essential and unnoticed as the coat rack. I took my place at my high desk, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I needed to see the Sterling Trust file again, the one I had hidden yesterday behind the water-damaged manifests. Mr. Higgins was late, presumably hungover from celebrating the efficiency of his department. I seized the moment. I grabbed a stack of blank invoices to use as a cover and slipped into the archive room. The air was stagnant, smelling of dry rot and decaying paper. I climbed the ladder, my fingers trembling as I reached behind the stack of ruined manifests. My hand brushed against the rough cardboard of the folder. It was still there. I pulled it down, clutching it to my chest, and hurried to the darkest corner of the room, hidden behind a towering wall of filing cabinets. I opened the file. I needed to find a weakness, a crack in the armour. I began to read, not just skim, as the partners did, but read. I analysed every line of the debt instrument, every clause, every addendum written in cramped legal script. The document was a demand note issued by the Bank of London 10 years ago, secured against the Sterling North acreage. I remembered that acreage. It was a boggy, useless stretch of land where the sheep often got foot rot. Why would the bank lend £10,000 against a swamp? I turned the page to the valuation report, and then I saw it. My breath hitched. The valuation was dated August 1888. The surveyor had listed the acreage as prime development land, pending railway access. I closed my eyes, accessing the map of the estate in my mind, the eidetic memory that Alistair had always mocked as a parlour trick. The railway? The railway didn't go through the North acreage. The plans had changed in 1889. The line was diverted south through the valley. The bank had lent the money based on a projected value that never materialised. When the railway moved, the land became worthless again. That was why the bank had bundled the debt and sold it to Thorne and Higgins for pennies. They thought it was a bad asset secured by mud. But then my eyes drifted to the bottom of the page, to a scribbled calculation in the margin. It was a chaotic mess of numbers, presumably written by the bank clerk who had processed the sale of the debt to my firm. He had calculated the maturity date of the loan based on a standard 20-year term. He had written June 1908. I looked at the original contract again, Clause 4, Section B. In the event that the borrower enters into any new financial obligation exceeding £1,000, the lender reserves the right to accelerate the maturity of this note to the immediate fiscal quarter. I froze. The clerk had missed Clause 4. He had treated it as a simple mortgage, but it wasn't. It was a restrictive covenant. Alistair was currently commissioning a wedding that cost £50,000. He was signing contracts with florists, jewellers and caterers every single day. Every signature he placed on a vendor's contract was a violation of Clause 4. The debt wasn't due in 1908, it was due now. The math in the margin was wrong, the clerk had erred. Thorne and Higgins had valued this asset at £200 because they thought they had to wait 18 years to collect a single penny. They didn't know they were sitting on a trigger. If I owned this paper, I wouldn't have to wait. I could walk into Stirling Manor, present the proof of Alistair's spending, and demand the full £10,000 immediately. He wouldn't have it. He would default. And upon default, the collateral transfers to the holder of the note. I wouldn't just get the money, I would get the North acreage. And then another memory surfaced. A memory from 2 weeks ago, before I was thrown out. I had been organising Alistair's correspondence and had seen a letter from a geologist he had ignored. The geologist had found deposits in the North acreage, not coal, not gold, kaolin, china clay. The white gold used to make porcelain. The very thing the potteries in Stoke-on-Trent were desperate for. The land wasn't worthless. It was a gold mine disguised as a swamp. And neither the bank, nor Thorne and Higgins, nor Alistair knew it. I did. I stared at the paper, my hands shaking so hard the page rattled. The value of this document wasn't £200. It was a fortune. It was the power to unseat a Viscount, but I had a problem. A massive, insurmountable problem. I needed £200 to buy the debt from my firm before they realised what they had. I checked my pocket. I had the 3 gold sovereigns Mr. Higgins had thrown at me, £3. I was £197 short. I might as well have needed £1 million. I heard footsteps approaching the archive room, heavy, deliberate steps. "Miss Thorne," Mr. Higgins's voice boomed. "Are you in there? There is a gentleman here to see you. Says he's from your former household." My blood ran cold. I shoved the file back onto the shelf, hiding it behind the manifests. I smoothed my dress, pinched my cheeks to bring colour back into my pale face, and stepped out into the light. Standing in the lobby was not Alistair. It was worse. It was Mr. Silas, the estate steward, the man who had carried out the eviction, the man who had laughed as he locked the gates. He was holding a hat in his hands, looking out of place in the city, but his eyes were sharp as flint. He knew I had taken the journal, and he hadn't come to chat. Miss Thorne, Silas smiled, revealing yellowed teeth. We have unfinished business. I looked at him, then at the file room behind me. I had the weapon to destroy them, but I was unarmed. I needed time, and I needed money. Mr. Silas, I said, my voice surprisingly steady. I suppose you've come for the book. Among other things, he stepped closer, invading my personal space. The smell of wet wool and malice was suffocating. The Viscount wants you to return home. He says he acted in haste. I stared at him. It was a lie, a trap. Alistair didn't want me back. He wanted to silence me. But as I looked at Silas, I realized something. He didn't know about the file. He didn't know about the clay. He thought I was just a desperate girl with a stolen diary. I will consider it, I said, but first I need to finish my work. Now, Miss Thorne. Silas gripped my arm. His fingers were like iron bands. Let go of her. The voice came from the door. We both turned. Standing there was a man I had never seen before. He was leaning against the doorframe, dressed in a suit that was frayed at the cuffs but cut with impeccable style. He was flipping a gold coin over his knuckles. I believe the lady is busy, the stranger said. He looked at me, and his eyes, dark, amused, and dangerously intelligent, locked onto mine. And I believe, Miss Thorne, that you and I have a mutual interest in the number 197. How did he know? I looked at the stranger, then at Silas, then back to the file room. The walls were closing in. Who are you? I whispered. The stranger smiled, catching the coin in his palm with a sharp snap. I'm the investor you didn't know you needed. I had prayed for a miracle. I just didn't expect the devil to answer. The coin in the stranger's hand didn't just snap, it sang. A sharp metallic note that cut through the tension in the lobby like a razor blade. Mr. Silas, a man who could strangle a fox with his bare hands and not blink, hesitated. His grip on my arm didn't loosen, but his eyes shifted from me to the man leaning against the doorframe. This is private business, Silas growled, his voice a low rumble of threatened violence. Walk away, fancy man, before you lose your teeth. The stranger pushed himself off the doorframe. He wasn't a large man, not like the bear-sized Silas, but he moved with the fluid, predatory grace of a jungle cat. He walked toward us, his boots making no sound on the floorboards. He was dressed in a suit of dark charcoal, well cut but worn at the elbows, the attire of a gentleman who had fallen from grace but remembered how to land on his feet. I wouldn't recommend that, the stranger said, his voice smooth, carrying an accent that was cultured but edged with the grit of the London streets. You see, Silas, it is Silas, isn't it? The sheriff is currently drinking a pint at the Red Lion down the street. I believe he's looking for a man fitting your description regarding an altercation with a chimney sweep last Tuesday. Silas stiffened. The accusation was specific, too specific to be a guess. I don't know what you're talking about, Silas spat, but he released my arm. He looked at me, his eyes promising retribution. The Viscount is waiting, Miss Thorne. Don't make him wait long. With one last glare at the stranger, Silas shoved his hat onto his head and stormed out into the rain, the bell above the door jingling pathetically in his wake. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I leaned back against the reception desk, my legs suddenly feeling like water. I looked at my saviour. How did you know about the chimney sweep? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The stranger smiled, a crooked, cynical expression that didn't quite reach his eyes. I didn't. But men like Silas always have a chimney sweep, or a baker, or a wife they've wronged. It's a safe bet. He pocketed the coin. Miss Thorne, we don't have much time. Higgins will be coming out of his office any moment to see what the commotion is about. My carriage is outside. Why should I go with you? I asked, narrowing my eyes. You know my name. You know the exact sum I need. You are watching me. I am, he admitted unabashedly. I've been watching the sterling accounts for 2 years. I've been waiting for Alistair to make a fatal mistake, but you found it first. He extended a gloved hand. My name is Julian Vance, and I believe we are about to become partners. Julian Vance. The name struck a chord. He was the younger brother of the Duke of Ashford, disowned 5 years ago for gambling debts and unsavoury associations. He was a pariah, a black sheep, and he hated the aristocracy as much as I did. I took his hand. 10 minutes later, we were seated in a private booth at a coffee house 3 streets away, shielded from the rain and prying eyes. Julian placed a leather satchel on the table. £197, he said quietly. It's all there. I stared at the satchel. It was more money than I had ever seen in one place. It was freedom. It was a weapon. What do you want in return? I asked, looking up at him. Men like you don't give away fortunes for charity. Men like me? He chuckled, pouring himself a cup of black coffee. You mean gamblers, scoundrels? You're right. I want 50% of the profit when we sell the land. The land, I repeated. So you know about the Cowlin? I suspected, he corrected. I knew the bank overvalued the land 10 years ago, but I couldn't figure out why. I thought it was just incompetence. But when I saw you, the meticulous Miss Thorne, the human calculator, fixating on a worthless debt note, I knew there had to be something buried in the mud. It's not just the clay, I said, leaning in, my voice dropping. It's the timing. The debt isn't due in 1908, it's due now. I explained Clause 4. I explained the wedding expenses. I walked him through the logic I had assembled in the archive room. As I spoke, I watched his face. The cynicism melted away, replaced by a look of genuine respect and something darker. Anticipation. Brilliant, he murmured, tracing the rim of his cup. He's walking into a bear trap and he thinks he's walking down the aisle. But Evelyn, we need to be certain. If we buy this debt and the clause doesn't hold up in court, we are left with a piece of paper and I am out £200. We need to verify the acceleration clause is legally binding under the 1888 Banking Act. I memorised the Act, I said quickly. Memory is not admissible evidence, Julian countered sharply. We need a precedent. We need to find a case where this specific clause was enforced. We need to go to the law library. The law library is for members only. Men only, I reminded him. Good thing I still have my brother's membership card, he grinned, pulling a small ivory card from his vest pocket. Shall we? The law library was a cathedral of silence and dust. Rows of leather-bound books stretched up into the darkness of the vaulted ceiling. We moved quickly, Julian pulling volumes of case law while I scanned the indices. For an hour, the only sound was the turning of pages. I felt a bead of sweat trickle down my back despite the chill. If we were wrong, if there was a loophole I had missed. Here, Julian whispered. He shoved a heavy book across the table. Regina v. Blackwood, 1885. I read the summary. A merchant had borrowed money, violated a restrictive covenant regarding luxury expenditures, and the lender had seized his assets immediately. The judge's ruling was clear. A borrower who spends on vanity while owing on necessity forfeits the protection of the term. It was identical. It was ironclad. It holds, I breathed, feeling a rush of endorphins that was better than wine. We have him by the throat. Julian closed the book with a heavy thud. Then let's go buy your firm's trash and turn it into our treasure. We returned to the carriage, the energy between us electric. We drove back to Thorne and Higgins. The office was closing. Mr. Higgins was locking the front door. I jumped out of the carriage before it fully stopped. Mr. Higgins! He turned, startled, dropping his keys. Miss Thorne, I thought you had left. What is the meaning of this? I found a buyer for the sterling debt, I said, breathless. The distressed asset, the £200 note. Higgins frowned. That garbage? Who would want it? I represent a private investor, Julian stepped out of the shadows, looking every inch the wealthy eccentric. I collect oddities. Bad debts from noble families are a hobby of mine. I'll give you £200 cash right now to take it off your books. Higgins looked at Julian, then at the cash Julian flashed. Greed warred with suspicion in his piggish eyes. Greed won instantly. "Done," Higgins said, unlocking the door. "Come inside. I'll sign the transfer." 15 minutes later, I stood on the wet pavement outside the office, clutching the deed of assignment. It was done. I owned the debt. I owned the rights to the Sterling estate. The paper felt heavy in my hands, pulsating with potential energy. Julian stood beside me, lighting a cigarette. The smoke curled up into the rain. "You have the weapon," Julian said. "Now you have to deliver the blow." "I'll go to the Manor tomorrow," I said, tucking the deed into my bodice, right next to my beating heart. "I'll present it to him before the wedding." Julian turned to me, his face illuminated by the flicker of a street lamp. His expression was grim. "You can't go tomorrow, Evelyn." "Why not?" "Because while you were inside signing the papers, I bought the evening edition of the Gazette." He pulled a damp newspaper from his coat pocket and handed it to me. I looked at the front page, my blood turned to ice. "Viscount Sterling moves wedding forward." Due to an urgent family matter, the nuptials of Viscount Alistair and Lady Clara will take place tomorrow at noon. "Tomorrow," I whispered. "At noon." "He's rushing it," Julian said. "He must know he's on the brink. If he marries her at noon, her dowry transfers to his accounts by 1 p.m. He will pay off the debts. The clause will be nullified. The moment that ring touches her finger, your piece of paper becomes worthless." I looked at the clock tower down the street. It was 7:20 p.m. I had 17 hours. 17 hours to travel 50 miles, breach a guarded estate, and stop a wedding that was protected by the entire social elite of England. "I can't make it by carriage," I said, panic rising. "The roads are mud." "No," Julian agreed. "You can't." He threw his cigarette into the gutter. "But there is a cargo train leaving for the north in 40 minutes. It doesn't stop for passengers. But it slows down at the crossing near your estate." I looked at my grey dress. I looked at the deed. I looked at Julian. "I've never jumped onto a moving train," I said. Julian smiled, and this time it was a genuine, dangerous smile. "Then you better hike up your skirts, Miss Thorne, because we have a wedding to crash." The cargo train did not offer the comfort of a passenger carriage. There were no cushioned seats, no tea service, and certainly no heating. There was only the deafening roar of iron wheels on iron tracks and the biting wind that whipped through the slats of the wooden boxcar. I sat huddled in the corner on a pile of rough-grained sacks, my teeth chattering so violently I thought they might crack. Julian sat opposite me, looking remarkably composed for a man who had just bribed a conductor with a bottle of gin to look the other way. "You're shivering," he noted, his voice raised to be heard over the clatter of the wheels. He took off his heavy wool coat and draped it over my shoulders. It smelled of tobacco and expensive cologne, a stark contrast to the smell of coal dust and livestock that permeated the car. "I am fine," I lied, pulling the coat tighter. "I am just calculating." "Calculating what? The wind speed?" "The interest," I said, staring at the dark countryside rushing past through the slat. "Every second we travel, the interest on Alistair's debt compounds. By the time we arrive, he will owe me another 3 pence. Julian laughed, a low, appreciative sound. "You are terrifying, Evelyn. Remind me never to owe you money." We arrived at the village of Little Hangleton, just as the sky was turning a bruised purple, the first hint of dawn bleeding into the night. We jumped from the moving train as it slowed for the crossing, rolling into the wet grass of the embankment. My grey dress was mud-stained, my hair wild, my boots scuffed. I looked exactly like what Alistair said I was, a beggar. Perfect. "We have 6 hours until the ceremony," Julian said, checking his pocket watch as he dusted off his trousers. I will go to the telegraph office. I need to wire the sheriff to meet us at the manor at noon sharp. We need the law on our side when the deed drops. No, I said, standing up and smoothing my skirts. You go to the sheriff. I have another stop to make first. Where? You need to get to the manor. Alistair's debt isn't just to the bank, Julian. He owes the butcher, the baker, the farrier. If I am to take his crown, I must first take his people. I left Julian at the crossroads and walked into the village. It was waking up. Shutters were opening and the smell of baking bread filled the air. But the mood was not festive. Usually a viscount's wedding meant a holiday for the tenants, a feast, a celebration. Today, the village felt sullen. I walked into Garrison's butcher shop. Mr. Garrison was a giant of a man with hands like hams and a face that was permanently flushed. He was hacking at a side of beef with a cleaver, his strokes angry and violent. "We're closed, girl," he grunted without looking up. "Go to the back if you want scraps." "I don't want scraps, Mr. Garrison," I said, stepping into the sawdust-covered shop. "I want to buy a debt." He stopped, the cleaver hanging in mid-air. He turned slowly, his eyes narrowing as he recognized me. "Miss Thorne, I heard you were thrown out, living in the gutter in London, they said." "They say a lot of things," I replied, walking to the counter. I placed a single gold sovereign, one of the 3 Mr. Higgins had given me, on the chopping block. The gold shone brightly against the blood-stained wood. "I know the Viscount owes you for the Christmas goose and the spring lamb, and the venison for the engagement party." Garrison scoffed, wiping his hands on his apron. £80 he owes me. 80! Says he'll pay me after the wedding. Says the new bride is bringing a chest of gold. "He won't pay you," I said softly. "He will pay the bank first, then the tailors in London, then the jewellers. You, Mr. Garrison, you are last in line. You will never see a penny." The butcher's shoulders slumped. He knew I was right. "I will buy the debt," I said. "I will give you £10 now, cash, and I will sign a contract promising the full remaining 70 within the week, secured against the manor itself." "You?" He laughed, but it was a desperate laugh. "You have nothing." "I have the mortgage," I whispered. Silence filled the shop. Garrison looked at me, really looked at me. He saw the steel in my spine. He saw the mud on my dress and the fire in my eyes. He reached out and took the sovereign. "Make him bleed, Miss Thorne," he said. By 8 a.m. I had visited the baker and the candlemaker. I had consolidated the village's anger into a bundle of signed IOUs tucked into my pocket. I now owned Alistair's food, his light, and his warmth. Now it was time to enter the lion's den. I walked the 2 miles to Stirling Manor. The gates were open, admitting carriages of florists and musicians. I didn't walk through the front. I circled around to the servants' entrance, the path I had walked 1,000 times with muddy boots. The kitchen was a chaotic symphony of panic. Cooks were shouting, maids were running with silver platters, and in the centre of it all was Mrs. Potts, the housekeeper. She looked ready to faint. "We are short-staffed," she screamed at a scullery maid. "The Viscount wants the silver polished again. He says it looks dull." I stepped into the doorway. "Mrs. Potts." The room went quiet. The staff turned. They looked at my ragged appearance, my dark circles, my trembling hands. To them, I looked like a ghost returning to haunt the pantry. "Evelyn," Mrs. Potts gasped, her hand going to her chest. "Oh, my poor child, look at you." I have nowhere else to go," I stammered, pitching my voice to sound weak, broken. I slumped my shoulders, letting the fatigue I truly felt take over. "Please, I just need a meal. I'll work. I'll scrub the floors. I'll do anything." "He'll throw you out if he sees you," the cook warned. "He won't see me," I begged, grabbing Mrs. Potts's hand. "I'll stay in the scullery. Please, I am starving." Mrs. Potts looked at my face, then at the frantic kitchen. She needed hands, and she had a soft heart. "Here," she thrust a rough apron at me. "Cover that dress, get to the back scullery, polish the champagne flutes, and for God's sake, stay out of sight." I tied the apron around my waist. I bowed my head submissively. "Thank you, Mrs. Potts, thank you." I hurried to the back scullery, a small room connecting the kitchen to the main dining hall. I grabbed a cloth and a crystal flute, but I didn't polish. I moved to the crack in the door. From here I could see the grand hall. It was transformed. Garlands of white roses, thousands of them, draped the staircase. Silk ribbons hung from the chandeliers. It was breathtakingly beautiful, a fairy tale purchased on stolen credit. And there he was. Alistair stood by the fireplace, drinking. It was 9 a.m., and he was already drinking. He was dressed in his wedding finery, a charcoal morning suit with a silk cravat, but his face was pale. He was shouting at his best man. "Where is the lawyer?" Alistair snapped. "The dowry transfer must be signed the moment the vows are spoken, not an hour later. Immediately." "He is coming, Alistair," the best man soothed. "Relax, you're shaking." "I am not shaking." Alistair threw his glass into the fire. It shattered, the sound echoing through the house. "I am simply eager." He was terrified. He knew how close he was to the edge. I watched him, feeling a cold detachment. I remembered how I used to look at him with adoration, how I used to think his tantrums were passion. Now I saw them for what they were, the fear of a small man in a big house. "Boy!" Alistair shouted at a passing footman. "My boots are scuffed. Get a rag." The footman hesitated, looking around for a cloth. "I said get a rag." Alistair raised his hand to strike him. "I will do it, my lord," I said. I stepped out of the shadows of the scullery. I kept my head down, my hair falling forward to obscure my face. I knelt at his feet with my polishing cloth. The room went silent. Alistair looked down at the servant at his feet. He didn't recognize me. To him, I was just another faceless drone to serve his needs. "Make them shine," he sneered, looking over my head at the mirror. "I want to see my reflection when I crush the world beneath my heel." I scrubbed the leather of his boot, left, right, left, right. I could feel the deed of assignment pressing against my ribs, burning like a brand. "You are tense, my lord," I whispered, keeping my voice low and rough. "The burden of nobility," he sighed, arrogant to the end. "Surrounded by incompetence. Even the girl who used to do my accounts, she was useless. Had to throw her out like garbage." My hand froze on his boot. "Garbage," I repeated softly. "Worthless," he confirmed, "though she had a certain utility." I finished the left boot. I started on the right. I was so close I could have driven a knife into his ankle, but that would be too quick, too merciful. "Is the bride ready, my lord?" I asked. "She's upstairs, crying over her veil or some nonsense. Women, they have no concept of the stakes." He kicked my hand away. "That's enough. Get out of my sight." I stood up, keeping my head bowed, and backed away into the shadows. "Yes, my lord," I murmured. I retreated into the scullery, my heart beating a war drum against my chest. He hadn't recognized me. He was so blinded by his own ego that he couldn't see the executioner polishing his shoes. I looked at the clock on the wall. 10 a.m., 2 hours to noon. I needed to signal Julian. I needed to get the sheriff into position. But as I turned to the back door, a figure blocked my path. It wasn't a servant. It was a woman in a dressing gown of white lace, her hair cascading down her back in golden waves. Her eyes were red from crying. It was Lady Clara, the bride. She stared at me, her eyes widening. She didn't look at my apron, she looked at my face, and unlike Alistair, she saw me. "You," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You're the girl from the portrait in the library, the one he hid in the attic." I froze. There was a portrait. "Lady Clara," I curtsied, trying to maintain the ruse. "I am just the maid." "No." She stepped closer, and I saw something in her hand. It was a letter on my stationery. "You are Evelyn, and you are the only one who can tell me the truth." She held up the letter. "Is it true? Is he really bankrupt?" I looked at the weeping bride. I looked at the letter. I looked at the door leading to the hall where Alistair waited like a spider. I could lie. I could tell her everything was fine, let her marry him and destroy him afterward. Or I could use her. I reached out and took the letter. "Lady Clara," I said, dropping the servant's voice and letting the cold, hard tone of the new Evelyn rise to the surface. "He isn't just bankrupt, he is a corpse walking. And if you marry him, you are digging the grave," she gasped. "But," I stepped closer, "if you want to survive today, you are going to have to do exactly what I say." "What? What are you going to do?" she stammered. I smiled, and for the first time in 6 months, it was a smile of genuine joy. "I am going to crash a wedding." Lady Clara Halloway was not a stupid woman. She was merely a sheltered one. There is a distinct difference. Stupidity is a lack of capacity. Shelter is a lack of data. As she stood in the dim light of the scullery, clutching the letter that had shattered her world, I watched the data flood in. Her hands, encased in white silk gloves that cost more than my father's lifetime earnings, trembled violently. He told me the estate was profitable," she stammered, looking up at me with wide, wet eyes. "He said the debts were merely cash flow restructuring. He used words I didn't understand and I—" "You believed him," I finished for her, my voice devoid of pity. Pity was a luxury for those who weren't fighting for their lives. "Because you wanted to be a viscountess, because your father wants a title in the family to wash the coal dust off his money. Alistair sold you a dream, Clara. But I am holding the receipt, and I can tell you, the goods are damaged." I reached into my bodice and pulled out the deed of assignment. I didn't hand it to her, I wasn't that foolish, but I held it close enough for her to see the seal of the Bank of London and the transfer stamp to Aurora Holdings, the shell name Julian and I had invented. "This is the mortgage on Sterling Manor," I whispered, the sound cutting through the distant noise of the kitchen staff. "It is due today, at noon. The moment you say 'I do,' your dowry will be seized to pay this piece of paper. You won't be the mistress of a great house. You will be the wife of a pauper living in a rented flat in Cheapside. And your father's fortune will vanish into the black hole of Alistair's gambling debts." Clara gasped, pressing a hand to her mouth to stifle a sob. "My father. He will kill him. He will kill Alistair." "He might," I agreed calmly. "Or if you were smart, he will simply destroy him." "What do you want me to do?" she asked, her eyes searching mine. "Why are you helping me? You're the enemy. The rat in the walls, Alistair called you." "I am not helping you, Clara. I am using you," I said, leaning in. The honesty shocked her into silence. "I want the estate. You want to avoid a scandalous marriage to a bankrupt fraud. Our interests align. I need you to walk down that aisle." "What?" she recoiled. "You want me to marry him?" "No, I want you to start the performance. I need Alistair to believe he has won. I need him standing at that altar, arrogant and exposed, surrounded by the witnesses he paid to impress. And then, I need your father to see this." I pulled a folded piece of parchment from my pocket. It wasn't the deed. I would never let that out of my sight. It was a summary. A single page listing Alistair's 3 largest debts, the dates of default, and the acceleration clause highlighted in red ink. "Give this to your father," I commanded. "Don't give it to him now. He will cause a scene in the dressing room, and Alistair might talk his way out of it in private. Give it to him right before the processional, when he is standing at the back of the Great Hall, waiting to walk you down the aisle. When the music starts. When it is too late to turn back quietly." Clara took the parchment. Her fingers brushed mine, hers soft and pampered, mine calloused and stained with ink and boot polish. "Why?" she whispered. "Because the only thing worse than a broken heart is a public humiliation," I said, "and I intend to give Alistair both." I sent Clara back to her chambers to dry her tears and powder her nose. I stripped off the filthy apron, smoothed my grey dress, and slipped out the back door of the kitchen. The air outside was crisp, the storm having passed, leaving the sky a brilliant, deceptive blue. I made my way to the stables, where the carriages were beginning to line up. The guests were arriving. I spotted Julian immediately. He wasn't hiding. He was leaning against a sleek black carriage, chatting amiably with the sheriff. He had cleaned up since the train ride. He was wearing a morning suit that, while slightly dated in cut, fit him with an elegance that money couldn't buy. He looked every inch the Honourable Julian Vance, the prodigal son returning to the fold. He caught my eye and gave a subtle nod. The sheriff, a stern man with a walrus moustache named Constable Miller, looked less comfortable. He kept patting the breast pocket of his coat, where the warrant likely resided. I didn't approach them. I couldn't be seen with them yet. I circled back to the side entrance of the Great Hall, slipping through the door that led to the musicians' gallery. The Great Hall of Stirling Manor was a masterpiece of architecture, designed 300 years ago to intimidate anyone who walked through its doors. Today, it was designed to deceive. The air was thick with the scent of white lilies, hundreds of them, masking the smell of damp that plagued the east wall. The sunlight streamed through the high stained glass windows, casting pools of ruby and sapphire light onto the stone floor. I climbed the narrow spiral staircase to the gallery. It was cramped, dusty, and filled with the violin cases of the orchestra hired from London. I hid in the shadows of the organ pipes, peering down through the wooden lattice. The view was perfect. Below me, the county's elite were taking their seats. I saw the Duchess of Whittington adjusting her monocle, likely calculating how much the flowers cost. I saw the local magistrate, looking bored. I saw the creditors I had visited in the village, Mr. Garrison the butcher, the baker, the candle maker, standing awkwardly at the back, invited only to keep them pacified, promised payment after the feast. They looked uncomfortable in their Sunday best, clutching their hats. And there was Alistair. He stood at the altar, flanked by his best man. He looked magnificent. The fear I had seen in the library was gone, plastered over with a veneer of triumph. He nodded to the guests, smiling that charming, boyish smile that had allowed him to borrow money for so long. He looked like a king about to be crowned. My stomach twisted. For a moment, a wave of nausea hit me. I remembered standing next to him in this very hall when we were children, practicing ballroom dancing. I remembered him swearing he would protect me. Liar. The heavy oak doors at the back of the hall opened. A hush fell over the room. The organist, sitting just a few feet away from me, cracked his knuckles and began the opening chords of the wedding march. The crowd stood. Lady Clara appeared in the doorway. She was a vision in white lace, a veil covering her face, but she wasn't moving. Beside her stood her father, Mr. Halloway. He was a short, stout man with the aggressive posture of a bulldog. He was known for his ruthlessness in the coal industry. He didn't suffer fools, and he certainly didn't suffer thieves. He was holding Clara's arm to escort her. But he wasn't looking at the altar. He was looking at a piece of parchment in his hand. The parchment Clara had just slipped him. The music swelled. Dum, dum, da, dum. Alistair beamed, rocking back on his heels. He saw the bride. He saw the dowry walking toward him. Mr. Halloway stopped reading. He looked up. Across the long expanse of the aisle, his eyes locked onto Alistair. Even from the balcony, I could feel the heat of his rage. He leaned down and whispered something to Clara. She nodded, a small jerky motion. Then Mr. Halloway did something that made the Duchess of Whittington gasp audibly. He didn't walk down the aisle. He marched. He left Clara standing at the door and stomped down the centre of the nave alone, the parchment crumpled in his fist. The music faltered. The organist hesitated, looking at me in confusion, but I stayed hidden. Alistair's smile faltered. He took a half step forward. "Mr. Halloway, is something wrong? Where is Clara?" Mr. Halloway didn't stop until he was at the foot of the altar steps, eye level with the Viscount. The silence in the hall was absolute. The lilies seemed to hold their breath. "You wretch!" Halloway's voice boomed, echoing off the stone vaulting. It wasn't a question, it was a verdict. "I beg your pardon." Alistair laughed nervously, looking around at the guests. "This is highly irregular. If this is a jest—" "A jest?" Halloway threw the parchment at Alistair's feet. "You call bankruptcy a jest? You call luring my daughter into a destitute house a jest?" The crowd erupted in murmurs. Alistair turned pale, his eyes darting to the paper on the floor. That is slander," Alistair stammered, his voice rising in pitch. "Who gave you that? It's lies. My estate is solvent. The audit—" "The audit was a fabrication," Halloway roared. "I have just been informed that you possess debts exceeding the value of this entire property. You aren't a Viscount, Sterling. You're a beggar in a silk suit." Alistair looked frantic. He looked for an exit, but the aisle was blocked by the angry father. He looked to the side and saw the creditors, the butcher and the baker, stepping forward from the back, their faces grim. The illusion was shattering. "This is preposterous," Alistair screamed, trying to regain control. "I am the Viscount Sterling. I demand respect. Who told you this filth? Who is trying to sabotage me?" "I did." I didn't shout. I didn't have to. The acoustics of the gallery carried my voice clear and sharp as a bell. I stepped out from behind the organ pipes and walked to the edge of the balcony, looking down at the chaos I had orchestrated. The grey dress, the servant's apron gone, my hair pulled back severe and tight. Alistair looked up. His eyes widened in genuine shock. He squinted against the light streaming through the stained glass, trying to reconcile the figure above him with the girl he had thrown into the snow. "Evelyn," he breathed. "Hello, Alistair," I said, gripping the railing. "I believe you dropped something." I reached into my pocket and pulled out the deed. I held it over the railing, letting it hang there, a sword of Damocles suspended by a single thread. "Mr. Halloway is right," I announced to the room. "He is a beggar, but he is wrong about one thing." I locked eyes with Alistair. "He doesn't own this house anymore. I do." Alistair's face went purple. "Seize her!" He shrieked to his guards. "She's a thief! She stole my ledgers! Arrest her!" Two burly guards started toward the stairs, but the doors at the back of the hall banged open again. "I don't think so," a voice called out. Julian Vance walked in, cool and unhurried, and behind him, looking very official and very unhappy to be involved in a domestic dispute, was the sheriff and 4 armed deputies. "Viscount Sterling," the sheriff announced, his voice tired. "I have a warrant for the seizure of assets regarding the default of the North Acreage loan, and I believe—" "The lady has the paperwork." Alistair looked at the sheriff. He looked at Halloway. He looked at me. And then he did the only thing a coward knows how to do. He ran. He scrambled over the altar rail, knocking over the communion wine, and bolted for the sacristy door. "Stop him!" Halloway shouted. I watched him run. I didn't move. I didn't need to chase him. The doors to the sacristy were locked from the outside. I had locked them myself before I went up to the gallery. He slammed into the wood, clawing at the handle, trapped like a rat in a cage. He turned around, his back to the door, sliding down to the floor as the sheriff's men advanced up the aisle. The wedding was over. The execution had begun. But as the deputies reached for him, Alistair looked up at the balcony, his eyes burning with a hatred so pure it felt like heat on my skin. He reached into his coat pocket. He didn't pull out a weapon. He pulled out a match, and he dropped it onto the terrified, alcohol-soaked carpet of the altar. "If I can't have it," he screamed, a manic grin splitting his face, "no one will." The dry old wool ignited instantly. The fire didn't just catch, it roared. Fire is a living thing. It breathes, it hungers, and when it is born from spite, it screams. The moment the match touched the alcohol-soaked wool of the altar carpet, the flames didn't just crawl, they leaped. A wall of orange heat erupted between Alistair and the advancing deputies, a barrier of pure destruction born from his madness. The great hall, moments ago a cathedral of silent judgment, dissolved into bedlam. The Duchess of Whittington shrieked, a high, piercing sound that shattered the paralysis of the crowd. Guests scrambled over the pews, overturning chairs, trampling the white lilies in a desperate stampede for the exits. The musicians in the gallery dropped their instruments, the hollow thud of a cello hitting the floor echoing like a body falling. But I didn't run. I stood gripping the railing of the balcony, looking down at the inferno. This wasn't just a fire, it was an attack on my home. "The tapestries!" Mrs. Potts screamed from the doorway, her hands clutching her apron. "The velvet curtains! It will catch the roof!" Alistair stood behind the wall of fire, his silhouette dancing like a demon. He wasn't trying to escape anymore. He was laughing, a jagged, broken sound that rose above the roar of the flames. He watched the smoke curl toward the ancient timber ceiling, the ceiling his ancestors had commissioned, and he smiled. If he couldn't be the Lord of Stirling Manor, he would be the king of its ashes. "Let it burn," he howled, his face distorted by the heat. "Let it all rot." The sheriff's men fell back, shielding their faces from the searing heat. They were paralyzed by the ferocity of the blaze. Even Mr. Halloway, a man of iron and coal, looked terrified. They were waiting for orders. They were waiting for the Viscount to tell them what to do. But the Viscount was the arsonist, so I took his place. "Don't look at him!" My voice cracked through the smoke, sharp and authoritative. "Look at me!" The servants, the footmen, the ushers, the very men who had looked through me for years, looked up. They saw me standing on the balcony, not as the girl who polished the silver, but as the woman who held the deed. "The rug is wool!" I shouted, my mind racing through the physics of the fire. "It will smoulder before it spreads. Grab the runner, pull it away from the panelling." The footmen hesitated. The fire was terrifying. "Do it," I commanded, pointing at the terrified head footman. "Thomas, grab the end. Pull it to the centre of the stone floor, now." Thomas moved. The instinct to obey a direct order overrode his fear. He lunged forward, grabbing the unburnt end of the burning carpet. Two other footmen joined him. With a heave, they dragged the flaming mass away from the dry wooden wainscoting and into the centre of the stone aisle. "The punch bowls," I directed, pointing to the refreshment tables near the entrance where the guests had fled. "Use the ice, use the lemonade, douse it." It was chaotic, it was undignified, but it worked. The staff, finally having a leader, swarmed the fire. Buckets of melting ice, crystal bowls of expensive punch, and vases of flower water were thrown onto the flames. The fire hissed, spitting angry steam into the air, fighting back, but it was starving on the stone floor. The orange flames turned to thick grey smoke. The fire died, and as the smoke cleared, coughing and sputtering, the barrier between the law and the criminal vanished. Alistair stood alone near the altar. His face was soot-stained, his wedding suit singed, his hair wild. He looked small. The grand villain, stripped of his pyrotechnics, was just a frantic man in a ruined room. The sheriff didn't hesitate this time. He lunged through the smoke, tackling Alistair to the ground. Alistair thrashed, screaming obscenities, kicking out at the deputies, but they pinned him to the stone floor, the same floor he had ordered me to scrub. "Get off me!" Alistair spat, his face pressed against the wet, ash-covered stones. "I am a peer of the realm. You cannot touch me. I will have your badges. I will have your heads." "You have the right to remain silent," the sheriff grunted, twisting Alistair's arms behind his back and clamping the cold steel cuffs onto his wrists. "Though I doubt you have the capacity." I walked down the spiral staircase from the gallery. My descent was slow, deliberate. The guests who hadn't fled, the morbidly curious, the Halloways, the creditors, parted for me as if I were royalty. The air smelled of burnt wool and sweet lemonade, a sickening combination. I stopped a few feet from where Alistair lay. The sheriff hauled him to his knees. Alistair looked up. His eyes found mine. There was no remorse in them, only a cold, baffled fury. He truly didn't understand how this had happened. In his mind, the world was built to serve him. A reversal of this magnitude was a glitch in the universe. "You," he sneered, blood trickling from his lip where he had hit the floor. "You little rat! You think this is over? You think a piece of paper makes you one of us?" "The paper makes me the owner, Alistair," I said, my voice calm, contrasting with his hysteria. "The law doesn't care about your bloodline. It cares about your signature." "The law?" He laughed, a wet, hacking sound. He looked around at Mr. Halloway, at the Duchess, at Julian, who was standing quietly by the door. "Do you hear her? She speaks of the law. She's a servant, a charity case I fed from my own table. She has no breeding. She has no right." He struggled against the cuffs, thrusting his chin toward me. "Look at her. She's wearing a maid's dress. She smells of ink and poverty. You think the courts will uphold a deed held by a woman who doesn't even know who her father is?" The room went silent. The insult hung in the air, ugly and raw. He was trying to strip me of my victory by attacking my identity. He was banking on the classism of the crowd. He thought they would side with a fallen lord over a risen commoner. I looked at Mr. Halloway. The coal tycoon was staring at Alistair with absolute disgust. He knew what it was like to be judged for new money. Alistair had just insulted every person in the room who had ever worked for a living. "My father," I said, my voice cutting through the silence, "was a merchant who paid his debts, which makes him twice the man you are." Alistair's eyes narrowed. "I will fight this. I will hire the best solicitors in London. I will tie this up in chancery for decades. You will never step foot in this house as mistress. I will burn your reputation until you are begging on the street again." "With what money, Alistair?" Julian stepped forward. He held up a small notebook, the black ledger I had used to record the village debts. "You have no assets," Julian said, his tone conversational. "You have no cash, your accounts are frozen, and as of this morning your credit rating is non-existent. No solicitor in London will take your case on a promise." Alistair stared at Julian. Then he looked back at me. The reality began to sink in. The walls were truly closing in, but his arrogance was a survival mechanism. He couldn't let it go. "It doesn't matter," Alistair sneered, drawing himself up as much as he could on his knees. "Take the house. It's a rotting pile of stones anyway. But you will always be nothing, Evelyn. You will walk these halls alone. No one will marry you. No one will visit you. You will be the queen of nothing." He looked at Lady Clara, who was standing by her father, still trembling. "And you," he spat at her. "You stupid weeping cow. You missed your chance to be a viscountess. Enjoy your coal money. You were never good enough for the sterling name." Mr. Halloway moved so fast I barely saw it. He stepped forward and delivered a resounding slap across Alistair's face. The sound was like a pistol shot. "Get him out of here," Halloway growled to the sheriff. "Before I kill him." The sheriff nodded and hauled Alistair to his feet. "Move," the sheriff ordered. Alistair was dragged toward the great oak doors. He didn't go quietly. He kicked and screamed, shouting threats, shouting about his lineage, shouting that he was the victim of a conspiracy. "I am the Viscount Sterling," he screamed as they pushed him through the doors into the bright, cruel sunlight. "I am the Viscount." The doors slammed shut. The silence that followed was deafening. The smoke drifted lazily toward the ceiling. The water from the melted ice pooled on the stone floor, soaking the hem of my dress. I stood in the center of the aisle. The guests were staring at me. They were waiting to see what I would do. Was I the maid? Was I the mistress? Was I a usurper? Julian walked over to me. He didn't bow. He didn't offer a platitude. He simply extended his hand. "The show is over, Evelyn," he said softly. "But the work is just beginning." I looked at his hand. Then I looked at the ruined altar, the soaked carpet, and the terrified staff huddled in the corner. Alistair was right about one thing. The house was a mess. but he was wrong about the rest. I turned to Mrs. Potts. She flinched, expecting me to yell, expecting the cruelty she had lived with for 10 years under Alistair's rule. "Mrs. Potts," I said. "Yes, miss," she stammered. "Open the windows to let the smoke out," I said, my voice steady. "And then please prepare tea for the guests who remain, Earl Grey, and use the good china." Mrs. Potts blinked, her shoulders relaxed. A small smile touched her lips. "Yes, ma'am," she said. "Ma'am." The word hung in the air. It wasn't Miss, it wasn't Evelyn, it was the title of the lady of the house. I looked at the deed still clutched in my hand. Alistair was gone. The arrogance had been dragged out in handcuffs. But as I looked around the room, I realised something. The battle with Alistair was over, but the war for the estate and for the respect of a society that despised me had just begun. I walked toward the library. I had a phone call to make to the Bank of London, but before I could leave the hall, Lady Clara stepped into my path. Her veil was torn, her face streaked with mascara. She looked like a fallen angel. "You saved me," she whispered. "I saved the house," I corrected. "You were just collateral damage." "No," she shook her head, her eyes hardening. "You saved me from him, and now I owe you." I looked at the daughter of the coal tycoon. I looked at the power of her father standing behind her. Alistair thought I would be alone. He thought I would be isolated. I smiled. "Yes, Clara," I said. "You do." The fire was extinguished, but the vultures were just beginning to circle. 3 hours had passed since Alistair was dragged out in handcuffs. The sheriff had left, taking the chaos with him, but a new, quieter threat had arrived in a black carriage bearing the crest of Whitmore, Stone and Associates, the most expensive, ruthless law firm in London. I sat in the library, the very room where I had been dismissed as the help only days ago. I sat in Alistair's high-backed leather chair. It was too big for me, but I didn't shrink into it. I sat forward, my elbows on the mahogany desk, my hands clasped over the ledger. Opposite me sat Sir Arthur Pendleton. He was a man who looked like he had been carved out of cold tallow, pale, soft, and utterly devoid of warmth. He adjusted his spectacles, looking around the library with a sniff of disdain, as if the smell of lingering smoke offended his delicate sensibilities. Julian stood by the window, watching the driveway. Mr. Halloway sat in the corner, nursing a brandy, watching me with a look of calculating curiosity. "Miss Thorne," Sir Arthur began, his voice oily and patronising, "let us be reasonable. You have had your moment of theatrics, the fire, the sheriff, the interruption of the wedding. It was all very dramatic. But now the adults must speak." "I am listening," I said, my voice flat. "The Viscount is currently in custody, yes," Sir Arthur continued, opening a sleek briefcase. "But the charges will not stick. Arson. A man cannot commit arson on his own property, and as for this," he gestured vaguely to the deed of assignment sitting on the desk, "this purchase of the debt, it is highly irregular." "It is perfectly legal," Julian interjected from the window. "I witnessed the transfer myself." Sir Arthur smiled, a tight pursing of lips. "Ah, the Honourable Mr. Vance, always tilting at windmills. The issue, however, is not the transfer. It is the intent. The Bank of London, whom I represent alongside the Viscount's family trust, views this transaction as predatory. You, a former servant with insider knowledge, exploited a clerical error to seize a peer's estate. No judge in England will uphold it. They will view it as theft by deception." He slid a piece of paper across the desk. It was a cheque. £500, Sir Arthur said. "A generous sum. Enough to set yourself up in a modest shop somewhere, far away. In exchange, you sign the deed back to the trust, and we forget this embarrassing incident ever occurred." £500. It was a fortune to the girl who had polished boots yesterday. It was a bribe to the woman I was today. I looked at the cheque. I didn't touch it. "You think I want the house?" I said softly. Everyone wants the house, my dear, Sir Arthur sighed. It is a symbol. It is a money pit, I corrected. The roof leaks in the east wing. The stables are rotting. The grain output has declined for 5 years. As an agricultural asset, Stirling Manor is a liability. Sir Arthur frowned. He hadn't expected me to know the operational details. Then why go to such lengths? Is it mere revenge, a woman scorned? Revenge is a hobby, Sir Arthur. I am a businesswoman. I reached into the drawer, the same drawer I had stolen the journal from, but I didn't pull out a journal. I pulled out a folded, heavy document that had been gathering dust in the back of the archives for 10 years. I hadn't shown this to Julian. I hadn't shown it to anyone. It was the card I had been holding up my sleeve since Act 3. Do you know why the bank lent the late Earl £10,000 on a swamp? I asked. I assume they saw potential in the farming yields, Sir Arthur dismissed. No, I said. They lent it because of this. I dropped the document on the table. It landed with a heavy thud that seemed to shake the room. Geological Survey, North Acreage, 1880, classified eyes only. Sir Arthur looked at the cover. He hesitated. Then, with a trembling hand, he opened it. The late Earl commissioned this survey before he died, I explained, watching his face lose its colour. He found it, kaolin, pure white china clay, massive deposits, the kind of deposits that fuel the potteries of Stoke-on-Trent for a century. Mr. Halloway stood up in the corner, his brandy glass forgotten. Clay, he breathed. On this land? Tons of it, I confirmed. The Earl died before he could exploit it. And Alistair. He was too lazy to read his father's papers. He saw dirt and thought it was useless. But the bank suspected. That's why they valued the loan so high initially. But they lost the paperwork. They forgot. I leaned forward. But here is the twist, Sir Arthur. Look at page 4. Sir Arthur turned the page. He froze. That is Alistair's signature, I pointed out. Dated 3 years ago. Impossible, Sir Arthur whispered. He said he knew nothing of the mineral rights. He lied, I said. He found the survey 3 years ago. He signed a verification of the findings. And then he hid it. He hid it because he wanted to sell the mining rights privately, off the books, to pay his gambling debts without the bank taking a cut. He was defrauding his primary creditor. The room went deadly silent. That is fraud, Julian said, walking over to the desk. Criminal fraud. It pierces the corporate veil of the trust. It voids his bankruptcy protection. And, I added, looking straight at Sir Arthur, it means that if you try to void my purchase of the debt, I will hand this document to the Crown prosecutor. The bank will be implicated for negligence. The trust will be dissolved. And Alistair won't just be in jail for the weekend. He will be in prison for 20 years. Sir Arthur stared at the document. The perspiration on his forehead was visible now. He looked at the cheque for £500. It looked pathetic. You knew, he whispered. You bought the debt because you knew about the clay. I bought the debt because the Viscount laughed at me, I said coldly. The clay? That's just my dowry. I picked up the cheque for £500. I tore it in half, slowly, the sound of the ripping paper loud in the quiet room. I don't want your settlement, Sir Arthur. I want the deed formalised, today, or I release the survey to the press tomorrow. Sir Arthur stood up. He was shaking. He snapped his briefcase shut. He looked at me with a mixture of hatred and grudging respect. You are a dangerous woman, Miss Thorne. I am a distinct woman, Sir Arthur. There is a difference. He turned and marched out of the room, his team of solicitors scrambling after him. He wouldn't fight. He couldn't. I had the nuclear option. The door closed. Mr. Halloway walked over to the desk. He looked at the survey, then at me. The coal tycoon, the man who ate competitors for breakfast, was smiling. Kaolin, he muttered. White gold. You're not just the owner of a manor, Evelyn. You're sitting on an empire. Yes, I said. I am. I can help you extract it, Halloway said immediately. I have the equipment. I have the rail lines. We can be partners, 50-50. 60-40, I countered instantly. My favour. Halloway laughed, a loud, booming laugh. Done. My God, why didn't my daughter have your brains? She has a good heart, I said. Don't undervalue that. We will draw up the papers in the morning, Halloway promised, shaking my hand vigorously. Welcome to the industrial age, Miss Thorne. Halloway left to attend to Clara. I was left alone with Julian. The adrenaline was fading, leaving me exhausted. I slumped back in the chair. You didn't tell me about the signature, Julian said quietly. I needed an ace in the hole, I admitted. You played it well. He walked to the desk and picked up the torn cheque. But you realise what you've done, don't you? I secured the estate. No. Julian looked at me, his eyes serious. You humiliated the bank. You forced the hand of a major law firm. And you just revealed that this land is worth millions. So? So, Julian walked to the window, looking out at the twilight. Alistair was just a pawn, a lazy, incompetent pawn. But now the real wolves are coming. The mining syndicates, the rival banks, they won't care about deeds or laws. They will just want the clay. He turned back to me. You defeated the Viscount, Evelyn. But can you defeat the industry? I looked at the heavy curtains, shielding us from the night. I thought the war was over. I realised with a sinking feeling in my stomach that I had just started a much larger, much more dangerous game. I don't know, I whispered. Well, Julian said, pulling a pistol from his coat and placing it on the desk next to the ledger. We better find out fast. Why? I asked, alarmed by the weapon. Because, Julian nodded toward the window. There are lights coming up the driveway, and they aren't carriages, they're wagons, and they aren't carrying lawyers. I stood up and ran to the window. In the distance, a dozen torches flickered in the darkness, moving steadily toward the house. The village? No, the villagers were my allies. Who are they? I asked. I don't know, Julian cocked the pistol. But they're wearing masks. The pistol on the desk was a dark, heavy thing, smelling of gun oil and violence. Julian stood by the window, his silhouette cut sharp against the flickering orange light of the torches outside. The rumble of wagon wheels on gravel grew louder, a low, grinding sound that vibrated through the floorboards of the library. Stay back, Julian warned, his voice low. If they breach the doors, aim for the leaders. Panic is our only advantage. I stood behind him, my heart hammering against my ribs, not with fear, but with a cold, calculating dread. I had outsmarted lawyers, outmaneuvered a viscount, and survived a fire. Was I to lose it all now to a mob of hired thugs? Was the industry Julian spoke of coming to take by force what they couldn't take by law? They are at the steps, Julian said, cocking the hammer. The click was deafening in the silence. Bam! Bam, bam! A heavy fist pounded on the front door. The wood groaned under the assault. Open up! A voice roared from outside. It was rough, gravelly, and familiar. I frowned. That wasn't the voice of a London mercenary or a hired gun. Wait, I whispered, reaching out to touch Julian's arm. Don't shoot. Evelyn, they have torches, Julian hissed. I know that voice, I said. I moved past him, ignoring his hiss of protest, and walked out of the library into the smoke-stained hall. The pounding continued. Open the damn door before we break it down. I unlocked the heavy bolts. I threw the door open. The night air rushed in, cold and biting. Standing on the portico, illuminated by the guttering flames of pitch torches, was a wall of men. They weren't wearing the suits of bankers or the uniforms of soldiers. They wore leather aprons, flour-dusted coats, and rough-spun wool. At the front, holding a torch that cast long dancing shadows across his scarred face, was Mr. Garrison, the butcher. Behind him stood the baker, the blacksmith, and the stable hands. Julian lowered the gun, stepping into the light, confusion written on his face. "Mr. Garrison?" I asked, pulling my shawl tighter against the chill. "What is this?" Garrison lowered the torch. He looked at the gun in Julian's hand, then at me. He spat on the ground. "We heard," he grunted. Word travels fast when the sheriff drags a viscount out by his collar. "Heard what?" "That the vultures were circling." Garrison gestured with his chin toward the driveway where the lawyer's carriage had just departed. "We saw the suits leaving. We saw the smoke. We figured the manor was vulnerable." "So you came to loot it?" Julian asked, his voice hard. The crowd grumbled. The blacksmith hefted a heavy iron bar, looking offended. "Loot it?" Garrison laughed, a dry, humourless bark. "Boy, this house owes me £80. It owes the baker 40. It owes the smithy 20. He turned his gaze to me. "Miss Thorne bought the debts. She holds the paper. If this house burns down, or if looters strip the silver, who pays us? No one." He stepped closer, looming over me. "We didn't come to loot, Miss Thorne. We came to guard the collateral." I stared at them. They weren't here out of loyalty to the Sterling name. They weren't here because they loved me. They were here because I had tied their financial survival to mine. By buying their debts in Act 5, I hadn't just bought leverage over Alistair. I had bought an army. "We brought the wagons," the baker added, stepping forward, "to move the valuables to the cellar if the fire spreads, or to block the gate if the bank tries to seize the livestock before we get paid." I felt a knot in my chest loosen. This was the world I understood. Transactional, brutal, and honest. "The fire is out," I said, my voice steady, "and the lawyers have been dealt with. The house is secure." Garrison nodded, seemingly satisfied. "Good. Then we'll set a watch at the gate. No one goes in or out without your say-so, not until we see our coin." "You will be paid," I promised. "With interest." "We know," Garrison said. He looked at the ruined foyer behind me. "You're a hard woman, Evelyn, but you pay your bills. That's more than the Viscount ever did." The night passed in a blur of activity. The villagers set up a perimeter. Julian and I sat in the library, drinking the last of Alistair's brandy, waiting for the dawn. When the sun finally rose, it didn't bring warmth. It brought the bailiffs. They arrived at 8 a.m., a grim procession of men in dark coats carrying clipboards and rolls of red adhesive tags. They weren't here to argue the deed to the land. That was mine. They were here for the personal chattels, the seizure of assets. Because Alistair had committed fraud, his personal bankruptcy protection was void. The creditors I hadn't bought out, the tailors in London, the gambling houses, the wine merchants, wanted their pound of flesh. I stood on the landing of the grand staircase, watching the dismantling of a dynasty. It was surgical. It was silent. It was devastating. A bailiff walked up to the portrait of Alistair's grandfather, the 4th Earl, and slapped a bright red tag on the gilded frame. Lot 402. Another tagged the velvet armchair Alistair loved to sit in while he mocked me. Lot 405. They moved through the house like locusts. The silver candlesticks, the crystal decanters, the hunting rifles, the silk tapestries that hadn't burned. Every item that defined the Sterling identity was catalogued, tagged, and seized to be sold at public auction. "This is brutal," Julian murmured, standing beside me. "They are stripping the history from the walls." "They are stripping the lies," I corrected. "None of this belonged to him. It belonged to the people he didn't pay." "Miss Thorne." I looked down. The head bailiff, a man named Mr. Crunk with a face like a dried apple, was standing at the bottom of the stairs. "We have finished the inventory of the main floor," Crunk said, ticking a box on his clipboard. "However, there is a matter of the personal effects in the master suite. The Viscount is currently being held at the sheriff's station, but the law requires a witness for the seizure of personal jewellery and wardrobe." "I will witness it," I said. I walked down the stairs, my boots clicking on the stone. I led them to the master bedroom. I hadn't stepped inside this room in years. It smelled of Alistair, sandalwood, stale wine, and arrogance. The bed was unmade. His wedding suit, singed and ruined, lay in a heap on the floor where he had changed before being dragged away. Mr. Crunk opened the wardrobe. It was filled with rows of bespoke suits, silk waistcoats, and riding boots. "Tag them!" Crunk ordered his men. I watched as they emptied the closet. Armfuls of silk and wool were thrown into canvas sacks. The physical shell of the Viscount was being packed away like trash. Then Crunk opened the jewellery box on the dresser. He pulled out the sterling signet ring, the heavy gold ring Alistair used to seal his letters, the ring he had waved in my face 1,000 times. "Solid gold," Crunk muttered. "Seize it." "Wait," I said. Crunk paused. "Mom?" I walked over and picked up the ring. It was heavy, cold. "This ring is listed as an heirloom in the estate inventory," I lied smoothly. "It stays with the house. It belongs to the land, not the man." Crunk looked at his list. He didn't see it there, but he looked at me, the woman who had just taken down a Viscount, and he decided not to argue. "Very well," he noted. "Item remains." I closed my hand over the ring. I wasn't saving it for Alistair. I was keeping it as a trophy. By noon, the house was a skeleton. The furniture was gone, leaving pale rectangles on the wallpaper where cabinets had stood for a century. The rugs were rolled up. The house echoed. It was empty, but it was mine. "There is one last thing," the sheriff said, appearing in the doorway. He looked tired. "The prisoner, the Viscount, has requested to see you." "Requested?" I raised an eyebrow. "Begged," the sheriff corrected. "He is being transported to Newgate Prison within the hour. He says he has information about the accounts. He says he will only speak to you." It was a trick. I knew it, but I also knew I needed to close the book. "I will go," I said. The village lockup was a small, damp stone building behind the sheriff's office. The cell was nothing more than a cage with a bucket. Alistair sat on the floor. He was still wearing the soot-stained shirt from the wedding. His hair was matted. His hands were cuffed. When I walked in, he didn't stand. He couldn't. The arrogance was finally gone, replaced by a hollow, shaking terror. The withdrawal from the alcohol was setting in. "You came," he croaked. "I did," I said, standing on the other side of the bars. "The sheriff said you had information." "I lied," Alistair whispered. He looked up at me, his eyes bloodshot. I wanted to know." "Know what?" "Is it true?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Did they take the horses? Did they take the portrait?" "They took everything, Alistair," I said, my voice devoid of malice. It was just a fact. "The house is empty. Your wardrobe is in a sack. Your horses are being sold to the knacker's yard to pay for the wine you drank last week." He flinched as if I had hit him. Tears began to stream down his face, cutting tracks through the soot. "My father's watch," he pleaded. "Sold." "My mother's pearls." "Sold." He put his head in his hands and sobbed. It was a pathetic, ugly sound. "I am the Viscount Sterling," he mumbled into his palms. "I am the Viscount." "No," I said softly. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the heavy gold signet ring. I held it up to the bars. "You were the Viscount," I said. "Now you are just inmate 409. Alistair stared at the ring. He reached for it, his fingers grasping at the air between the bars. "Please," he begged. "Please, Evelyn, it's who I am. Give it to me." "You told me once that I had no dowry," I said, staring into his desperate eyes. "You were right. I had to earn mine." I dropped the ring, not into his hand. I dropped it into the mud on the floor of the cell, just out of his reach. "Goodbye, Alistair." I turned and walked away. Behind me, I heard the sound of him scrambling in the dirt, clawing at the mud, weeping for a piece of gold that could no longer save him. I walked out of the jail and into the sunlight. Julian was waiting with the carriage. "Is it done?" he asked. "He is finished," I said. I climbed into the carriage. "Take me home." "To the manor?" "Yes." We drove back in silence. The village was quiet. The villagers tipped their hats as we passed, not out of love, but out of respect for the power I now wielded. We arrived at the gates of Stirling Manor. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the lawn. I looked up at the great house. It was dark. There were no candles in the windows. The furniture was gone. The servants were wary. I had won. I owned the stone, the land, and the clay beneath it. I was rich beyond measure. But as I stepped into the vast, empty foyer, my footsteps echoing in the hollowness, a chill settled over me that had nothing to do with the draft. I had destroyed my enemy. I had reclaimed my home. But as I looked at the spot where the altar had burned, I realized that in the process of burning him down, I had scorched the earth around me. I was the mistress of Stirling Manor, and I was completely, utterly alone. Or so I thought, until I saw the single white envelope resting on the bottom step of the grand staircase. It wasn't addressed to me. It wasn't addressed to Alistair. It was addressed to the owner of the clay. And the seal on the back wasn't a bank or a lawyer. It was the royal crest. I stopped, my breath caught in my throat. The crown. I had defeated a viscount. I had defeated a bank. But had I just picked a fight with the king? The wax of the royal seal did not crack. It shattered. I sat on the bottom step of the grand staircase, the marble cold against my legs, holding the letter that felt heavier than a brick of gold. The house was silent around me, a hollow shell stripped of its velvet and vanity, but the paper in my hands screamed of the future. I unfolded the parchment. It wasn't a warrant. It wasn't a summons. It was a contract. To the proprietor of the Stirling Clay Deposits, Her Majesty's Department of Industrial Supply requires immediate exclusivity regarding the extraction of kaolin for the production of high-voltage porcelain insulators essential for the electrification of the royal dockyards. Name your price. I stared at the words. Alistair had spent his life trying to curry favour with the crown through balls, hunts, and sycophancy. He had practically bankrupted the estate, trying to buy a nod from a duke. And here I was, the girl who had been thrown into the snow, holding a direct requisition from the Queen's own ministers. They didn't care about my lineage. They didn't care about my dowry. They cared about what I owned. I wasn't just a landowner anymore, I was a necessity. Bad news? Julian asked, his voice echoing in the empty hall. He had holstered his pistol, but he was still watching the shadows, ever the protector. No, I stood up, the letter crinkling in my fist. A slow, terrifying smile spread across my face. It seems, Julian, that the Empire needs insulation, and I am the only one who can sell it to them. So the king isn't coming to arrest us. The king is coming to do business. I walked up the stairs, my footsteps firm. Wake the staff. Tell Mrs. Potts to brew the strongest coffee she has. We aren't sleeping tonight. We have a counteroffer to draft. 3 months later. The smell of damp and rot was gone from Stirling Manor, replaced by the sense of fresh beeswax, lilies, and the sharp, metallic tang of industry. I sat at the head of the long dining table. It was not the same table Alistair had sat at. That one had been sold to a collector in France. This table was new, commissioned from a local carpenter in the village. It was solid oak, simple, sturdy, and paid for in cash. To my right sat Mr. Halloway, reviewing the mining yields. The north acreage, once the swampy shame of the estate, was now a bustling quarry. The railway spur had been completed in record time, thanks to Halloway's crews. Every day, tons of white clay left my land, bound for the potteries and the industrial plants of London. To my left sat Julian. He was no longer the outcast gambler. He was my chief of operations. He wore a suit that fit him perfectly, and the cynical edge in his eyes had been replaced by the sharp focus of a man building a legacy. And at the foot of the table, it was empty. I didn't need a sycophant or a spouse to validate my position. The profit margins are up 15% this quarter, Halloway grunted, tapping a ledger. The royal contract is lucrative, Evelyn, But the French are asking for export rights. We could double the output. No, I said, slicing into my breakfast. We keep the supply tight. Let them starve for it. Scarcity drives value. That is lesson 1. Ruthless, Julian murmured, smiling behind his coffee cup. Prudent, I corrected. The doors to the dining hall opened. Mrs. Potts entered, looking 10 years younger. She wore a crisp new uniform, and she walked with a bounce in her step. I had doubled the staff's wages the day the first cheque from the Crown cleared. "Ma'am," she curtsied, "the mail has arrived." She placed a silver tray on the table. On it lay a stack of business correspondence, bank statements, and investment opportunities. But on top, there was a single dirty envelope. It was made of rough, cheap paper, and it smelled of mildew. I knew that handwriting. It was jagged, desperate, and small. I picked it up. "My dearest Evelyn, the cold in Newgate is unbearable. The blankets are thin and the rats are bold. I hear rumours. The guards say you are the wealthiest woman in the county now. They say the king buys your clay. I am not asking for the estate back. I know I lost. But please, for the sake of the memories we shared, send me a coat. Send me a few pounds for food. I am rotting in here. Your childhood friend, Alistair." The room went quiet. Halloway and Julian watched me. They knew who it was from. I looked at the letter. I remembered the snow hitting my face when he threw me out. I remembered him laughing when he said I had no dowry. I remembered the fire he started on the altar, trying to burn down the roof over the heads of the people who served him. "What do you want to do?" Julian asked softly. I reached for my pen, a gold fountain pen that I had bought for myself. "Mrs. Potts," I said. "Yes, ma'am." "Does the scullery maid still need rags for the floor?" "Always, ma'am." "Excellent." I handed the unopened envelope to her. "Use this." Mrs. Potts took the letter, her face impassive. "Very good, ma'am." She left the room. I turned back to my ledger. I turned to the page marked Alistair Sterling. The column of numbers was long, a lifetime of debts, insults, and cruelty. I dipped my pen in the black ink. At the bottom of the page, I didn't write a number. I wrote a single word, in elegant, unbreakable script. Closed. I blew on the ink to dry it. "Now," I said, looking up at my partners, my eyes clear and dry, "let's discuss the French export rights. If they want my clay, they can pay triple." I stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the sun was shining on the green hills of the valley. In the distance, I could see the smoke rising from the kilns and the steam of the trains carrying my fortune to the world. I was 22 years old. I was unmarried. I was an orphan. And I was the mistress of everything I could see. The Viscount had told me I was nothing. He was wrong. I was the one thing he never understood. I was the bottom line, and the ink was finally dry.